our first keynote speaker today, I'm so excited to introduce to you, has had an incredible career spanning public administration, military leadership and complex project management. Tom Rogers is the former Australian Electoral Commissioner. Appointed in 2014, Tom has overseen 3 federal elections, numerous by-elections and boundary redistributions right across Australia. Most recently, he led the AEC through Australia's first referendum in nearly 25 years. Previously, Tom served as Executive Director of the Australian Institute of Police Management and held senior leadership roles in the Australian Army, including commanding a United Nations observer mission. Currently, Tom is on the advisory board of a major international democracy NGO. Now, there will be time for your questions following Tom's presentation, so if you can use the QR code that's on the screen or on the paper that's on your desk, and that'll take you straight into Slido. And then if you choose the first session, which is called Building Institutional Trust Through Independence, you just click on that. That will take you to the next screen and you'll see that you can just type your question in and hit enter. And then I'll be able to facilitate as many of those questions as I can in the time that we have remaining. So to share his wealth of experience and insight today, can we please welcome Tom Rogers?
Well, good morning, everybody. And normally when I'd start a presentation like this, I'd try to bring you into my confidence by telling you a story of when the AEC failed or where something went wrong but nobody found out. I'm just conscious of the audience here today. So let me say something else, that between December of 2013 and December of 2024, everything was perfect at the Australian Electoral Commission. And perhaps I'm going to talk about a few things this morning, but perhaps the thing to remember, one word is trust. And that's come through already through Carolyn's presentation this morning. And if we remember nothing else about what was that guy going on about, at the end of it, it's about trust. And I think for public sector managers, and particularly for electoral administrators and the work that you do as performance auditors, trust is the one true coin of the realm. And it's so important what we're seeing globally at the moment, to protect that trust. And as the title says, building that trust through independence is a critical part of the process. So Australians really love the democracy sausage. And I think, in a way, that whole thing of us grasping the democracy sausage as an icon is actually an example of quiet patriotism that Australians like. We're not sort of flag wavers, but that's a thing that's become very well known. It actually helps build trust. The AEC as an institution grabbed that symbol and really ran with it as well. I think the history of that, by the way, it starts at about the 1920s. There's a photo of a polling place in Queensland with a woman selling cakes. It's probably the first time that happened at a polling place, and since then, the advent of portable barbecues in the 1980s led to sausage sizzles at polling places, which I guess is an example of technology helping elections. And then it became the word of the year or the phrase of the year in 2016, but it's uniquely Australian and marks out our democracy. I don't want to mention particular countries, but that photo there, which is a photo of my former EA and I at a polling place, for a whole range of reasons, ended up on the screen at a very, very large international conference with a country that I won't name, but you might go there for a festival to drink beer, for example. And what I learned is that that particular country is very literal. And after the first couple of minutes, I had to say, forget the sausage. It's not relevant to this. It's a very Australian thing. So I can position this talk for you before I get into it. I want to give you 3 propositions that will help you understand our elections, and I want to tie it into a presentation after that. So, the first thing, elections are important. In some ways, They're one of the most important things that the public sector does to ensure the legitimacy of all activities of government. It's that critical and it's that important, and it's so important that we have citizens trusting the outcomes of those results. And I know it's not binary. We really need strong public sector, we need strong defence forces. But if you think about it for a minute, normally the security of a country doesn't collapse from the outside in. It's normally from the inside out. When you start to see a lack of trust, when you start to see people not trusting public sector outcomes. So the work that electoral administrators do and performance auditors do is critical to that. It's like if we had a house and we decided to spend all of our money on the very best alarm system and security system that we could possibly have with great cameras and great alarms, but we had a bad house with cracked foundations and people fighting inside. Doesn't matter how good that security system is, we need that system of trust. If you think about what was traditionally those sort of 5 pillars of a trusted society with an independent judiciary, a free press, a police, free from political control, a military under political control, free elections, and I think that's about 5. And so it's that critical. And transparency is part of that. That photo there is a great example of that. It's the person in yellow is one of the AEC's officers in charge of a booth. She is examining individual votes. The people in purple vests are AEC workers. But importantly, the 2 people standing up at the end of the table are party scrutineers. Everything is conducted transparently so that people trust those outcomes. But it's so important. So that's the first proposition. The second proposition is that elections really are wickedly complex. They are, without doubt, the largest peacetime logistic activity in the life of a country. And it's not relevant today to go through in huge detail all of the logistics, but I think at the referendum we had 105,000 workers, and we put that all together in 4 weeks and get rid of it a week after the event. The last time, I think the 2022 election or the referendum tricked up towards $500 million worth of expenditure, 60 million ballot papers, voting in 100 of our overseas missions. It is very much like building a Fortune 500 company in 4 weeks and dismantling it a week after the event. It's that complex. So if you bear that in mind, as we talk about this, it'll put a bit of context around what we're doing. And the final proposition before I get into it is something that it took me a long time to realise, and that is that elections are about the loser, not about the winner. And it was only when I finally realised that it made me understand how to conduct our communications in a way to engage citizens in a better way. And I say that because, with one exception, in my entire history, I never had a winner complain about the election. And I won't go into that because I don't wish to be sued by this particularly litigious person, but it's all about the concept, I guess we could summarise it as losers' consent. The election has to be run in a way that either there is zero evidence of anything going wrong, or, generally speaking, it's transparent enough for someone that might want to complain to have no grounds to complain. So I think if we remember that, it's about reputation, trust, and part of that is being as independent as one can be in the delivery of that service, so there's no conspiracy theory that someone else has their hand on the tiller as we move through. All right, so what I'd like to do is really walk through three areas and talk about trust using the AEC as a case study. I do want to talk about democracy. I think just while I've got the platform, and Carolyn, I hope you don't mind, but I do want to leave a thought about what I think we're doing well, but in particular the thing that's missing that I think if we want to protect trust in democracy we need to do. And then I put up their reward because we're talking to performance auditors and you've got to sit through my presentation, and I think if we can sit through I should give you a payoff. At the very end, no matter where we get to, I have 2 things that I think will be worthwhile. One of those is transformative, and if you do it, it will make your organisation a world's best. So I reckon that's not too bad. We stick together for about 30 minutes. I'll take questions at the end. I give you a reward. The payoff is you'll be able to implement something simple that will make your organisation a world's best. Nodding if we're happy with that. All right. So I'm conscious I'm talking about elections and I'm talking about elections during my time as Commissioner. There's some awkward timing involved here, and I just want to contextualise something. I am aware that there's been some news in the last few weeks out of WA about the state election here. In poor timing for me, the federal election has been called and is running, and a whole range of other things are occurring. May I tell you that this has been on the schedule for a large period of time, and so anything I say here is not related to those two things. I'm just going to say that a second time. Anything I say here this morning is not related to either the recent WA state election or the current federal election. It's important for me to say that, and I'm going to try and build on my experience and make it relevant for you on the way through. I know I'm talking a lot about elections. I promise you it's relevant, and I know that I'm speaking to senior people in this room who have equally valid experiences, but it's like that old Australian movie, The Castle, if everyone remembers that. And the start of that, there's that chap who says, I'm Dale Kerrigan and this is my story. Well, I'm Tom Rogers and this is my story, and I hope it's also applicable to you. All right, so first of all, a little bit of scene setting. What we find is that there are three phases in Australian democracy. Pre the secret ballot, which was an absolute riot. In fact, the first election in Sydney, I think in 1843, there was a lot of violence. A few people were shot and one man was killed down near the rocks. And Governor Gibbs, the governor, wrote back to the Home Office and said, all things considered, went pretty smooth. Because before the secret ballot, globally, that's what elections were. Quite often the way that you voted was printed in the newspaper and people tried to stop you from voting and there was violence. And post that, it was relatively calm, not totally, but relatively calm. And now we're in the digital era and it's extraordinary. We're seeing things globally that we never thought we'd see. Today is not a presentation about artificial intelligence. That's a separate presentation, but it really is going to have an impact on how we perceive our democracy. We're seeing things, Carolyn mentioned the US, I think in late February, and I don't say this critically, I'm observing, but President Trump wrote to the head of the Federal Electoral Commissioner in the US, ostensibly sacking her, and she's refused to accept the sack, and that process is still playing out in this new era that we never thought we would have seen. So there's an extraordinary global period, and the Australian Electoral Commission has been very fortunate in being able to really navigate their way through that. Despite a global collapse in trust, the Electoral Commission in Australia has managed to maintain trust, with 9 out of 10 Australians continuously telling the AEC that they trust the AEC to count the votes the way that they're cast. Not only that, at the end of 2023, the AEC was rated as the most trusted federal agency and also the agency with the highest level of public satisfaction. And I have to tell you that it wasn't an accident, and there are several things that the AEC did to make sure that that was the case. And I'd like to take you through those. Obviously, election management body, we looked for a mnemonic that related to the AEC. We did those things and it worked for the AEC whilst I was there, and I'd like to run through those at the moment. You'll see there's 2 R's at the end. Obviously it didn't fit my catchy mnemonic. Maybe if you just say it in a pirate voice it might make sense. But each of those things were important for the AEC to build that level of trust in a very deliberate way. And I think that for us, we realised early on, when I took over, I hate even going here because it's highly relevant to where we are, but I took over the AEC in 2013 after an electoral failure, when the Commissioner felt that he had to resign and I had to step up as deputy. And I don't know whether people remember that. We lost some votes. We had to rerun the Senate election. Hands up if anyone remembers that. Of course, performance auditors would have a memory. The good thing is many other audiences have forgotten about that. So I had to step in at a critical time and try and rebuild the organisation's public reputation and its reputation for independence. The very first thing we did, and the most important, was the first of those, about building values. Most organisations have values. I think many organisations don't understand their own values, or they're not meaningful for their own staff. I put that up deliberately because that, like that old story about the beer coaster in the pub, that handwritten thing on the left is actually in a pub when I sat down with a couple of executives when I took over. We need values urgently, and that's what we came up with up front. And then after a lot of working with the organisation, it ended up being the one on the right. And the critical thing for us was that issue of electoral integrity, because integrity breeds trust. Integrity is about independence, and it's that critical. And we've done a whole range of work with our own staff over that. Well, we did a lot of work, I should say, while I was there with our staff. It's still relevant, still valued. The staff still like those values, and they have helped anchor the organisation and give the organisation a purpose and an understanding about why integrity matters. I was criticised by a federal parliamentarian, I won't mention the individual, who went for a visit to Azerbaijan and came back and said that he had seen an election run in Azerbaijan the way it should be run, and that they could teach the AEC a few lessons about how elections should be run. And I'm sure they were efficient, but in 2013, they leaked the result of the election 5 days before the actual event. And there's a bit there about efficiency, but also electoral integrity. And so your values are a critical part of that process. And I think for us, whilst I was at the AEC, that was a really, really important step and the very first thing we did. And I think for any organisation coming out of a troubled period, if those values don't resonate with the staff, you really need to do some work on that. The second one of those little notes was operations, and there's a great photo there of one of the count centres at one of the elections. It's hugely complex. When I first arrived, if I was to use an analogy, it was a bit like running an election. It used to be like kind of a family kitchen. Everyone running around the kitchen, they kind of knew what they had to do, and there was food prepared at the other end, and people worked really, really hard, but it was very organic. And of course, as life went on and as things have become more complex, and particularly with the laser-like focus of social media on small issues, the family kitchen stuff just didn't cut it anymore. It doesn't work, and people know that it doesn't work. And so the analogy is we turned that into a commercial kitchen with standards and food hygiene and outcomes and a way of testing that. And it really meant that we introduced standard operating procedures in a way that we'd never done before. And it worked really well for the organisation. And still, the AEC uses those standard operating procedures to try and reduce the envelope where errors can occur, which again leads to a lack of trust and also breeds conspiracy theories where people say there are other people involved in the election and things are occurring that shouldn't be occurring. I've put training there, but it's really about people more than just training. It's everything to do with people. And the training that we were doing previously with the Electoral Commission was simply not adequate. It wasn't adequate in the current era. And just if I come back to that bit about trust and what builds trust, if I use a number about the number of people that might vote on the day of the election, if you take away the pre-poll for a minute, if you just look at voting on the day, maybe that's 11 million people. When you walk into the polling place, there are these 8 mini transactions that have to happen. You know, everything from you getting your name marked off, the right ballot papers are given to you, someone describes how to fill out the ballot paper formally, we make sure you put the ballot paper in the right box. If you multiply that out, it's a minimum of 80 million transactions on that day that you need to go flawlessly so that there's not an issue at the other end. And again, you can't do that if you don't have proper training. That bit about making sure staff are trained is a critical part because it's the front piece where citizens and candidates actually come into the polling place and look at what you're doing. So we fundamentally changed that. And in fact, last year, we ran for the first time ever a 3-day program for senior temporary staff. It's never happened federally in Australia's history, and we hope to analyse how that runs after the next election, whether it actually helped these individuals to make sure we were reducing the risk of error. And then, for me, this is probably the key one, and that's the issue of engagement, particularly in the modern era. Building trust through independence actually relies on engagement. And there are so many examples of where organisations have done this well and badly. From the AEC's perspective, I think this is one thing we did incredibly well over the last 10 years, and it's the thing that led directly to the increase in the levels of trust. We did more media work than we've ever done in the history of the AEC, and I'm going to make this sound incredibly trite. Please forgive me, but there's a method behind this story. When we lost the votes in 2013, when we moved forward, and a range of other things have occurred over the years, including at the referendum in end of 2023, where I was personally criticised. I don't know if people remember this thing with the referendum about ticks and crosses. Anyone remember that? That photo is me dealing with a media conference about that issue. I remembered years and years ago a movie starring Harrison Ford, please forgive me, I know this sounds so trite, called Patriot Games. Anyone see that movie? And there's a bit in there where the president's done something wrong, or a friend of the president's done something wrong, and the president says, I'm going to step away. And the Harrison Ford character says, no, you're not going to step away, you're going to step in. You're actually going to own this. And the more you own it, the less space you're going to give other people to criticise you. And it's absolutely true. And I think there's a thing about being a leader, a senior leader in a public sector agency. You don't win trust by being perfect, but you do win trust by being present and actually standing up and taking responsibility. I'll just use a euphemism here, we had an inadvertent data release. I think that's the euphemism we use for such things in the modern era, but we had an inadvertent data release a couple of years ago of some quite sensitive information. And as soon as we released that publicly, I went straight up to the ABC and did a media interview about it and actually owned it up front. And that was a really critical part, again, of building that issue of trust. So for me, there are a number of other examples, public sector examples. I think one of the big ones, if you're interested in a great case study of what to do, was I think it was the early 80s, Johnson & Johnson had an issue with Tylenol in the US where someone put cyanide in the Tylenol and 7 people died, and they really owned it. And it's about stepping forward and engaging with citizens, showing citizens that someone has their hand on the tiller and can be trusted. And probably the last of the big ones is resilience. I'll talk about reputation in a minute, and that's about organisations keep on keeping on despite the fact that things get tough, and making sure that we can move forward as an organisation. I know your organisations do this all the time. I know performance audits are frequently criticised, and if you decided to hide under a table because of a criticism about an audit, it's really tough. But you need a culture of resilience where staff are supported and you continue to perform at a high level right the way through, no matter what's going on. And the final one I mentioned was reputation. And for me, this is the most important thing we did as the AEC whilst I was there. We introduced a thing called the reputation management system. And I did this in direct response to what I saw globally, particularly and ladies and gentlemen, again, I'm not criticising, I'm observing, important for me to say that, but particularly what we saw in the US with that first election that got so heavily criticised. I've had a look globally, and for most of those elections, what fails, it's not a failure of administration, it's actually a failure of reputation, because the organisation has either failed to protect its own independence and built trust, or other people are trying to undermine it. So what the AEC did was to put in a whole range of things to manage that reputation. And it's really interesting. I think when we first did it, I called it a reputation management strategy, and we were missing something. I just couldn't work out what it was.